All right, welcome everybody to United in Diversity, Fighting the Anti-Trans Movement. This is a CLE that the Advocates for Human Rights is putting on in commemoration of Ida Hobbit, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. My name is Nathan Madsen. I'm a staff attorney with the Advocates for Human Rights, and with me is Ash Tifa, the Legal Services Program Coordinator at Rainbow Health. Both of us are here in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and we are happy to bring you this CLE today. So I want to just start off with going through what we're going to be doing today. The first thing that we're going to be doing is starting with a pre-quiz. And this pre-quiz is just for us to get a good understanding of where you're at when it comes to knowing what's going on with regard to the LGBTIQ plus community, and that stands for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, and other sexual and gender minorities communities here in the United States or abroad. Then we'll be moving through with definitions, and my colleague Anthony will put the link to the pre-quiz into the chat now, and feel free to get started on that. It's a short 3-question quiz just to see where everyone's at. Then we'll be moving into some definitions. Some of the language that we are using is pretty specific, and we want to make sure that everybody is on the same page and knows what it is that we're talking about as we go through. Then we are going to be turning to the global efforts to criminalize trans people. The anti-trans movement is certainly not focused only in the United States. That is the bulk of what we'll be talking about today, but it's important to put it into context to understand what's happening globally when it comes to the anti-trans movement. Then we'll be moving into US legislation and its impact on trans people. And then finally, we'll be looking at human rights law and LGBTIQ plus issues, because we at the Advocates for Human Rights take a human rights framework when it comes to our work. And that means that we are focused on using international human rights law to combat the violations that we see both domestically as well as internationally. And then we will end with a post-quiz and a Q&A. So hopefully Anthony has put into the chat the link for the pre-quiz. I will put it in again just to be safe for those of us who are joining a little bit late, but please just take a moment to work through that. And I will turn it over to Ash as she starts to go through some of the definitions, and please do work through that pre-quiz.
Thank you, Nathan. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ash Tifa. I use she, her pronouns. And as Nathan mentioned, I am the Legal Services Program Coordinator at Rainbow Health, a queer healthcare organization located here in the Twin Cities. I am also a transgender rights activist, advocate, and organizer with years of experience working within the trans community. And today on International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, I'll be discussing what these terms mean, how they present in daily life and society, and the current backdrop of the anti-LGBTQIA plus movement, and specifically anti-trans legislation happening here in the US. On your screen, you can see what we call the genderbread person. It identifies different aspects of who we are and what makes us us. So that includes our gender identity, our gender expression, our attraction, both sexual and romantic, and our anatomical sex. It's important to know that while all of this plays into who we are, none of this is binary. Each one exists on a different spectrum, and all of them exist separately. One does not lead to another. It is also important to note as we move forward, I will be using the term queer and the acronym LGBTQIA+ interchangeably when I'm referring to the community as a whole. Next slide, please. So we're going to get into some definitions. So first, starting off, homophobia is a range of negative attitudes, feelings, actions, or systemic structures that marginalize, stigmatize, or discriminate against individuals based on their homosexuality or perceived divergence from heterosexual norms. Some examples in how this plays out is oftentimes there's fear-mongering, spreading unfounded fears about the dangers of homosexuality. There's also stereotyping of perceived inferiority based on a patriarchal hierarchy that's demeaning of homosexual individuals. Biphobia refers to a range of negative attitudes, feelings, actions, or systemic structures that marginalize, stigmatize, or discriminate against individuals based on their bisexuality or perceived deviation from monosexual norms. When we see biphobia present itself in society, oftentimes there's either an expectation of disclosure, of proving that you're bi enough, you're attracted to both genders or whoever you're attracted to more than any other sexuality, and then also what's known as bi erasure. When we are talking about queer issues and we're talking about different sexualities and we're talking about representation in media, bisexuality is oftentimes ignored or looked over or conflated into other sexualities. When we talk about transphobia, which is what we're going to be spending the majority of our time talking about today, it can be defined as a range of antagonistic attitudes, feelings, actions, and systemic structures that deny, devalue, or discriminate against individuals based on their transgender identity or perceived divergence from binary normative gender expressions or roles. And there's a lot of ways transphobia presents itself in society. There's an pervasive idea that trans people aren't really the gender they say they are, and that one's gender identity is solely determined by one's biological sex at birth, and that this cannot be changed. This is not true. It's contradicted by modern understandings of gender as a spectrum and a social construct, as well as the lived experiences of trans people generally. There's also derogatory stereotypes that are very pervasive within societies. The derogatory stereotype and fear tactic used to delegitimize and stigmatize trans women that often comes up is men in dresses. This is also important to note in the way drag and the drag community gets weaponized against the trans community. Trans women are women. And then there are other stereotypes that come up when we're talking about the anti-trans movement. The notion that all transgender people are mentally ill or sexually deviant is particularly harmful, and we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics of that in a little bit. And then just quickly, the way these harmful ideations and bigotries present itself in daily life can be manifested through microaggressions, discrimination in workplace, schools, and families. And then there are significant mental health implications, which we will talk about in a second. So next slide, please. And we will talk about how transphobia presents itself in society, particularly within the US. Oftentimes what we're seeing is forced detransitioning of trans youth, which is a process where a transgender child is compelled, usually by external pressures, to revert to or maintain the gender identity that aligns with their sex assigned at birth, despite their self-identified gender identity. When it comes to trans youth, forced detransitioning could occur due to various factors, including lack of acceptance or understanding from parents, guardians, or the community around them, legislative restrictions on access to gender-affirming healthcare, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in a second, social stigma or discrimination. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to note that forced detransitioning can have significant psychological and emotional impacts on a transgender child. It can lead to feelings of depression, anxiety, and increased risk of self-harm or suicide due to the distress caused by having to suppress their true gender identity. As such, medical and mental health professionals widely agree that supporting trans individuals, including youth, in their self-identified gender is crucial to their overall well-being. There have been multiple studies done on belonging and microaggressions and adverse childhood experiences and its link to self-harm, suicide attempts, and suicidality. One study that I'd like to highlight, done in 2020, revealed that 56% of the trans youth surveyed had attempted suicide before, and 86% reported suicidality. It noted that interpersonal microaggressions, emotional neglect by family, and internalized self-stigma are the most significantly contributions to suicidality. And if we can move to the next slide. Another pervasive way that transphobia is showing up, particularly within the last few years, is a major increase in anti-trans propaganda. On your screen, you can see two of the nation's traditionally respected papers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, running anti-trans propaganda. These publications are entrusted with the responsibility to provide accurate and unbiased reporting, but as you can see here, are failing the trans community by offering platforms to voices that spread misinformation, sow doubt about the legitimacy of transgender identities as a whole, and unfairly characterize gender-affirming care as controversial or harmful. This goes beyond poor journalistic practices. It fuels transphobia, supports harmful stereotypes that we mentioned earlier, and directly contributes to a hostile social climate for transgender individuals. This reporting has real severe real-world consequences, such as promoting discrimination, enabling violence, and encouraging the legislative attacks against trans individuals that we will be talking about today. And I really, as we go into the next slide, really want to emphasize the enabling of violence aspect that this propaganda allows for and encourages. Please bear with me as I get through the next section, as it contains a profound amount of trauma on our community. Some of the most well-known or most notable, at least by mainstream media standards, of attacks on trans people and the queer community are the mass shootings of the Pulse nightclub in 2016 and last year's Club Q in Colorado Springs. These attacks are on safe spaces. Queer clubs in particular are safe spaces where we are able to gather as our true selves, and which is like historically rare and nearly sacred in our spaces, in our communities. And I'm glad these get as much attention as they did. But as we continue, we will see that other attacks don't gain the same amount of presence and talk in the media because they're not as, they haven't resulted in mass casualties in the same way. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about something that hasn't been getting as much media attention, which has been the recent increase on attacks on drag time story hours, which are events held for children, usually at public libraries, where drag queens will read children's books to children. As you can see on the screen, neo-Nazis in Ohio, Proud Boys in New York City. These events have become targets for far-right and fascist groups to intimidate, harass, and attack the queer community and to fearmonger and stoke fear publicly that these events are not safe in the name of protecting the children. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about something that really doesn't even get any attention in the media, is the daily violence that trans people face. The last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, are the most deadly on record for trans people, both globally and domestically. And by far, the vast majority of those attacked and killed are Black trans women. I really want to note the disparity here. Nearly above 75% of all these attacks happen on Black trans women. And I would like to take just a second to acknowledge my own privilege as a white trans woman in this conversation, because this is one side of the physical harm and danger that I personally am less likely to face. But hundreds and dozens of Black trans women in this country are attacked and murdered and dead named and misgendered when it is reported. And all of this ties together in this backdrop of what is happening to trans people here and across the globe. So if we move on to the next slide, we could talk about current trends and this global effort to criminalize trans existence, because we will get into the micro, but I think it is important to talk about the macro level issues about trans recognition and the attacks on our community. Globally, the Trans Legal Mapping Report discloses that only 96 countries across the world allow legal gender change, and among these, only 25 don't impose prohibitive requirements. I do want to flag that according to this report, the US is not one of those 25. According to this, the US does impose prohibitive requirements to allowing for gender change. And therefore, legal gender change remains unattainable completely in at least 47 UN member states. Across the world, there are still cross-dressing laws that are archaic and criminalize transgender individuals for existing, which include penalties that vary as far as like encompassing fines, lengthy prison terms, and even in some cases, like in Malawi, even corporal punishments. So when we look at this bigger picture of how both in the West and globally, there is a criminalization and delegitimization of trans existence. And there are some patterns that come up across the world when we're talking about how this is done. So we could talk about restricting access to gender-affirming healthcare, banning transgender individuals from participating in public life, and denying the ability to change one's legally recorded gender. We're seeing this play out in the US in the legislation we'll be talking about in a bit, but I want to reemphasize this is happening across the globe. This is a global right-wing effort to delegitimize the trans community. Another tactic that is being used in 2023, particularly in the West and particularly specifically in the UK, is the idea of gender ideology being used to critique the idea of gender as a spectrum. This is purported by right-wing factions and trans exclusionary radical feminists, specifically in the UK. This is going on as there is call to reform the Gender Recognition Act to allow for a simplified process for legal gender recognition changes. They argue, the critics, the right-wingers and the TERFs argue that these reforms would pose risks to cisgender women and girls, despite a lack of evidence to substantiate these claims. And within that, a common pattern we're seeing in both the US and UK as these debates and conversations are happening is the tactic of labeling those of us in the queer community as groomers. This is a misuse of the term grooming, which is traditionally associated with the manipulative behavior of sexual predators. By applying this term to advocates for queer rights, opponents are implying that these advocates or members of this community are attempting to manipulate children into identifying as LGBTQIA+. This false accusation not only lacks basis in reality, but also wrongfully equates queer existence with sexual predation. It's a tactic designed to incite fear and further stigmatize the queer community. I also just want to flag at this stage that this tactic is specifically taken from right-wing personalities and groups. So major platforms that are enabling this are Gays Against Groomers, Libs of TikTok, and Kiwi Farms. And the latter of the two also engage in doxing and swatting. Doxing being the public release of private information about an individual without their consent, meant to stoke fear, intimidate or harass the target, and lead to real-world consequences such as stalking, threats, or violence. And swatting referring to a tactic in which hoax calls are made to emergency services in an attempt to dispatch a large number of armed police officers or a SWAT team to a particular address to harass a person. Trans people are often the targets of this, and this tactic is specifically taken by Libs of TikTok, by Kiwi Farms, by anti-trans actors from Proud Boys, Patriot Front, unaffiliated Telegram far-right movement spaces, and far-right personalities like Andy Ngo. So there's a clear line between the anti-trans movement and the ongoing fascist authoritarian movement that's happening in the West. We go to the next slide. Click it again. So now we're going to talk about the current state of US legislation and its impact on transgender people. So the anti-transgender movement legislatively has been happening for about 10 years. If we can go to the next slide, we can kind of see the escalation over the course of the past 5 years. The first bathroom bill, which would prohibit transgender individuals using the bathroom according to their gender identity rather than their a sex assigned at birth, was introduced in Arizona in 2013. It didn't pass, but since then, these bills have become more and more prevalent. One of the more well-known bills, and when this conversation really started picking up steam, was North Carolina's HB 2, which passed in 2016. And it requires individuals to use the bathroom according to their sex assigned at birth in all government buildings. And since then, you could see how this has escalated nearly exponentially over the course of the past 5 years. And if we can go to the next slide, we can see the difference in the last year. So again, an exponential growth of the amount and the onslaught of these bills. And compared to the image on the previous slide, we can go to the next slide and see how this total racks up in the last 5 years. So more than the last 5 to 10 years combined. By my last estimation, my last count as of earlier this week, there was 527 anti-trans bills, anti-LGBTQ plus bills in state houses across the country. Of that number, of the 527, 34 have been enacted already. We go to the next slide with these numbers. 34 have been enacted already. 26 are awaiting a governor's signature, and 66 are still actively progressing. It's also important to understand that for the most part, legislative sessions are not over. Some are ending, but this is ongoing. This is still the first half of the year. And these laws have been progressing at rapid pace. So now we're going to look at some of the ways we can define and group these different bills that are moving forward in state legislatures. So we're going to start with the gender-affirming care bans because they are the most impactful and the most prevalent right now. So first of all, let's talk about gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care is vital and potentially oftentimes life-saving approach to healthcare for trans individuals. This form of care recognizes and supports a person's self-identified gender identity, thus significantly reducing the mental health risks often associated with gender dysphoria, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Studies have shown that access to gender-affirming care can greatly improve the quality of life and overall well-being of transgender people. It's a comprehensive healthcare approach that oftentimes includes hormone replacement treatment, puberty blockers for adolescents, affirmative therapies, mental health care, and in the case of consenting adults, affirmative surgeries. So of the 527 total bills happening in the US right now, 147 of them are bans on gender-affirming care. These restrictions have been proposed in at least 30 states and have, as of this week, passed in 14 states. So Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, Mississippi, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia, Montana, North Dakota, and Oklahoma have all passed these bills banning gender-affirming care. Most states are limiting them to transgender youth, but this is not always the case, and it is not the end goal. One example is Oklahoma. Senate Bill 129 proposes to extend gender-affirming care bans well into adulthood, according to the bill, up to 26 years old. For physicians, this means that providing the care supported by every major medical association would result in felony charges and a loss of a medical license. Similarly, in Wyoming, a bill would make a gender-affirming care child abuse. So this is kind of the pattern we're seeing. We can see it in Tennessee's bill, Senate Bill 1, which passed last month, which prohibits healthcare professionals from performing any type of gender-affirming care or risk losing their medical license. It also defines in the law that enabling a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the immutable characteristics of the reproductive system that define the minor as male or female as determined by anatomy and genetics existing at the time of birth. We see the legal definition being reduced to sex assigned at birth and the binary aspects within it, which I mentioned earlier is not the common modern understanding of gender or sex. Neither are binary, and equating a loss of medical license or felony charges or child abuse to gender-affirming care is really, you can see how it's an attack, a specific attack. Another area of these bills that I want to highlight are the Don't Say Gay laws. In March of 2022, there was mass media attention brought onto the state of Florida for their controversial legislation HB 1557, which aimed at restricting speech in public schools relating to gender identity and sexual orientation. Formerly entitled the Parental Rights in Education Act, widely known as the Don't Say Gay law, following public outcry. The law, which applies to public K through 12 schools in the state of Florida, bans classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity from kindergarten to third grade, and prohibits such instruction at any level if done in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. And I really want to flag that while the law started last year as kindergarten through third grade, we're not going to talk about or teach about sexual orientation or gender identity. Last month, the legislature expanded the Don't Say Gay law to include all grades K through 12 at the request of Governor DeSantis. So unless required by state standards or part as reproductive health instruction that students can choose not to take, it is illegal to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity with students in the classroom. You can also see this pop up in other states like Arkansas, which have prohibited in Senate Bill SB 294, which prohibits classroom instruction of any sexually explicit material, sexual reproduction, sexual intercourse, and then adds in gender identity or sexual orientation. Again, this is the same tactic we discussed earlier about conflating sexual predation and sexuality with identity, which is not the case. These bills frequently cite parental rights, and the Florida bill specifically limits the expression of queer teachers and students, but this has continued into 2023 with bills like Arizona HB 1700, encouraging parents to report and ban books which promote gender fluidity and gender pronouns, and SB 1001, also from Arizona, which requires that both a guardian and a teacher approve of a student's pronouns. So we can see how this is all escalating it goes from parental rights into a complete lack of attention to gender identity. I also want to talk about another wave of legislation that's drag bans, which redefine venues that host any gender non-conforming entertainment as adult-oriented businesses. So I want to call back to the drag story hour I mentioned earlier. Like I said, this is for children that happens at public libraries. They would, under these laws, like Tennessee HB 9, be categories as adult-oriented businesses. A quick quote from Dr. Lady J, a non-binary transgender woman and drag historian, notes that while these laws are targeting drag performers, the real attack is on trans people who, particularly in rural areas seen by rural police, are seen as having done drag in public, and that drag performers can find ways to perform outside of what is allowable. Trans people will continue having to hide our public lives, and that greatly reduces our safety. There are also, all of the 527, there are multiple aspects and avenues that different states are taking. What we see out of North Dakota, for example, you go to the next slide. Last month, a few weeks ago, they advanced a total of 10 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in a single day, almost as in an omnibus package. So if we go to the next slide, we could see that everything from prohibiting birth certificate changes to criminalizing gender-affirming care, to bathroom bans, to sports bans, all of this was passed in one day. It is now law. The governor has signed this entire package, and we can move forward into what we're seeing federally. Like when we look at this nationally all together, we're seeing it on a state by state, one's flipping red deeper and deeper. But we're also seeing the start of national anti-trans legislation. The Women's Bill of Rights, which was introduced by Marjorie Taylor Greene, seeks to erase trans recognition by the federal government, defining sex assigned as birth as immutable. There's also the My Child, My Choice Act, which seeks to extend the educational restrictions noted in individual states to apply federally. So as this movement is growing steam, as we head into not just the rest of the legislative sessions, but also the next federal election, this movement will continue to pose a danger to trans folks. Before I conclude and pass over to Nathan, I do want to flag some of the more concerning or dangerous developments. And that oftentimes is hand in hand with using directives or executive orders to undermine trans rights and democracy. So in Florida, it was ordered that the state healthcare board completely ban gender affirming care. There was no vote. It was an order to be done. Similarly, in Texas, Governor Abbott instructed the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate all parents with transgender children for child abuse. And last month, the Missouri Attorney General proposed rules to go in effect that would severely restrict gender affirming care and also put up a website that would allow concerned individuals to report any gender affirming care intervention they have seen or observed, which turned into a reporting tool against trans people and doctors and healthcare associations supporting gender affirming care. The website has since been taken down, but only due to community outrage and activists stepping up to take it down. So as the onslaught of legislation has continued, there is some positive legislation, but there are not really any safe protections that are able to completely combat this. So I'll finish up and pass it on to Nathan to talk about the human rights implications of all of this and possible pathways forward.
Thank you, Ash. And I want to reiterate what Ash mentioned earlier. Both she and I are operating from a considerable amount of privilege when it comes to talking about these issues. Though Ash is a trans woman and I am a gender non-conforming person, we are both not people of color. I'm also cis-passing, and so much of the legislation that is out there is not going to impact me or even impact Ash in the same way that it would other more marginalized people. And so we want you to keep that in mind when we are talking about these issues, that it is not just all members of the LGBTIQ plus community that are being impacted by this in the same way, though we all are being impacted. So I want to start off with talking about human rights law and what human rights law specifically says about LGBTIQ plus issues. There is unfortunately no specific treaty that directly addresses the human rights of LGBTIQ people, LGBTIQ plus people. However, the Yogyakarta Principles and the Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10, which were passed in 2007 and 2017 respectively, provide guidance on how to apply human rights law specifically to violations against LGBTIQ plus people. And the Yogyakarta Principles oftentimes deal with things that are parts of human rights law, such as legal recognition, security of the person, privacy, health, participation in public life, state protection, etc. These are aspects of human rights law that already exist and are already binding on countries that have signed human rights treaties or are obliged to follow customary human rights law. But what the principles do is they provide greater clarification on how these rights should be discussed and how they should be applied specifically to the issues that LGBTIQ plus people face. And I want to focus for just a second on legal recognition. And Ash had mentioned this during her section, but legal recognition is an incredibly important aspect of the transgender experience. And what it means is that it's the ability to change your gender marker on your identification documents and to be seen in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of the state as your gender identity. Of course, what this oftentimes means is that it still falls into a binary understanding of gender, that you're either male or female. Some countries do allow for a third option for people who are gender non-conforming or who otherwise do not fall male or female, but having your identity documents match your gender identity, and sometimes more importantly, your gender expression, are quite important, especially when you have states that are trying to regulate where people are able to participate in public life via their identity documents. So being able to change your gender from male to female or female to male is quite important. And the Special Rapporteur on Torture, an expert in the field of torture, has said that refusing to allow transgender people to change their legal gender leads to grave consequences for their enjoyment of human rights, including obstacles to accessing education, employment, healthcare, and other services. And further, the compulsory sterilization, which is one of the aspects that Ash had mentioned, forcing someone to have to become sterilized in order to have gender-affirming surgical interventions, or any sort of sterilization requirement in order to change one's legal gender is a violation of a person's right to non-discrimination and physical integrity. So the Yogyakarta Principles, though they are not binding law, there are treaties and customary law that specifically, which are binding aspects of law that specifically address LGBTIQ plus issues. And the United States is unfortunately very bad at signing and ratifying treaties. And so we are not obliged to follow much in terms of human rights law or treaty-based human rights law. But there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is customary international law, which means that though it did not start out as being a mandatory, it did not create obligations for the state. Because it is so well accepted, it is now obligatory for states to follow the rights within. The Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights both detail rights that transgender and LGBTIQ plus people can use to fight these anti-trans legislation in the United States. One of the primary areas is non-discrimination. Both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR, as well as many of the other treaties that the United States have not signed, specifically say that the rights within that convention must be applied to individuals without discrimination or without distinction of any kind, and that includes gender identity and expression. Also, both the UDHR and the ICCPR specifically say that all people are entitled to equality before the law, and that they, that they are entitled to equality before the law, and that the law shall prohibit discrimination and guarantee effective protection against discrimination, which directly applies to transgender people. Further, privacy is detailed in the ICCPR, saying that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference in privacy, and that everyone has a right to protection of the law against such interference of attacks. And finally, the Convention Against Torture details the state's obligation to protect against torture and prevent torture, as well as investigate and prosecute torture by state and non-state actors. So these three areas, or these three pieces of human rights legislation are really critical in holding the United States accountable for violations against transgender people. And the last piece of human rights law that I really wanted to talk about is the Universal Periodic Review. And the Universal Periodic Review is a process in which any country that is a member of the United Nations is able to make suggestions or make recommendations to a specific country every 5 years. And that country must respond to those recommendations. They can either support them, which means that they become obliged to follow those recommendations and fulfill those recommendations, or they can reject them. And these are three recommendations, the ones that you see on your screen, by Malta, France, and Belgium, that the United States has supported, meaning that between their previous review and their next review, they must fulfill these recommendations. And if they're not, they can be flagged in future advocacy work. And I want to focus specifically on the recommendation that Malta made. Malta says that the United States should strengthen measures to prevent and combat violence, especially the rate of murder of transgender women of color, as well as the violence experienced by broader lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. And the United States has had a history in terms of General Assembly resolutions, which are non-binding pieces of they're non-binding declarations of support for a particular area or lack of support for a particular area. The United States has abstained in the past on a resolution on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, which included a specific mention of promptly and thoroughly investigating all killings, including those because of a victim's sexual orientation and gender identity. So the United States in the past has said that they do not, that they are not going to take a proactive stance on that. But they did support Malta's recommendation to strengthen measures to prevent and combat violence. One could argue that that does not provide a clear way to measure whether or not the United States government has taken measures to prevent and combat violence, but it at least shows that the United States is on the hook for moving forward and trying to prevent this violence against trans women, and particularly trans women of color. So many of you are lawyers and are wanting to know, okay, what can I do to get involved? How can I participate in the anti-trans movement, or how can I combat the anti-trans movement? The Human Rights Committee, which is the treaty body that is responsible for reviewing the United States' compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is having or is going to be up for review. And so NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and organizations that are part of civil society are able to submit shadow reports to the Human Rights Committee detailing the United States government's failure to follow the rights that are in the ICCPR. And this would be an excellent opportunity to highlight some of the areas that the United States has failed to prevent violence against the trans community. In addition, the independent expert on SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity, is an expert who specifically looks at violations against the LGBTIQ plus community. And any individual or organization with information on violations against the LGBTIQ plus community can submit communications to the independent expert on SOGI and ask them to investigate the reported violations. And finally, the Advocates for Human Rights participates in representation, pro bono representation of asylum seekers that are in the United States, including a number of people who are specifically applying for asylum based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. I'm putting a link into the chat now, and we will follow up with a link in a subsequent email that if you're interested in serving as a pro bono representative, pro bono lawyer for asylum seekers, then you can click that link and sign up. Right now, we have LGBTQI plus asylum seekers from Lebanon, Senegal, Uganda, and Ecuador. You also do not need to be an immigration attorney in order to serve as a pro bono representative because we provide training, support, and resources. So we've presented a ton of information today, and unfortunately, we're just scratching the surface when it comes to the anti-trans movement in the United States, and we're aware of that. But we want to be able to send you off with some further resources that if you are interested in diving deeper into this area, that you can do some research on your own. These are three resources that you'll see on the screen that specifically deal with human rights and sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. The Born Free and Equal is a report from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. ILGA, which is the International LGBTIQ plus organization, has a database of laws and of other resources about what's going on across the world. And then finally, I mentioned the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. The current independent expert has a considerable amount of information on his website about not only gender identity and expression, but the entire LGBTIQ plus human rights experience. For those of you who are here in Minnesota, locally, we have several organizations that work very closely with the LGBTIQ plus organization. Rainbow Health, which Ash is an employee of, provides healthcare and advocacy services to LGBTIQ plus people. Outfront Minnesota is a longstanding organization in the community that provides care and service to the LGBTIQ plus community. And of course, the Advocates for Human Rights takes very seriously the work of protecting LGBTIQ plus people from human rights violations. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to you and see what questions and answers or what questions we might have in the Q&A. Looks like we don't have any yet. Oh, okay. Okay, so one question is, how do these laws approach intersex people? Are there obstacles intersex people might face under these laws? And have you heard of any intersex interests litigating against these laws?
Yeah, I could jump in on this one. As I discussed in the Tennessee bill that limits gender affirming care, sex is defined as male or female based on sex characteristics at the time of birth. Obviously, with the nature of intersex individuals, this is complete erasure. They are not being taken into account in these laws. It is specifically meant to perpetuate the binary, and the obstacle is the law in this case. I personally haven't heard of any litigation happening, but I'm sure it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure of any litigation that's happening, but whenever laws seek to define things in terms of the binary, it oftentimes means that there's intersex erasure, because even people who understand that gender is a spectrum sometimes forget that sex is also a spectrum, and that there is not only male and female when it comes to sex. Another question that I see is, how do the Don't Say Gay bills affect trans people? Ash, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I could start with that one. When we talk about, being able to talk about identity, whether it's sexual orientation or gender identity in schools, it's not this foreign concept that the right thinks it is. Like just being able to say, "Hi, my name is Miss Tifa. I have a wife." Things that come up in daily conversation with students is being limited here. I think it's also important to recognize the aspects of visibility that these laws limit. Knowing that there are people like you is a huge part of queer identity and the safety found within it. And not being able to talk about it is hugely limiting, especially for young people.
Exactly. I do want to add to that, but I also want to, before I forget, remind people that we do have a post test or a post quiz. I just put the link into the chat, as well as any feedback that you would like to provide, to please click on the feedback link to provide that as well. But to get back to this question, the other thing that I want to mention is that, much of the language of these Don't Say Gay bills or Don't Say Gay laws says that you cannot talk about sexual orientation and gender identity. That's the language that's in the bill. And what that presumes is that the only people who have a sexual orientation or gender identity are queer people and trans people. That cis heterosexual people do not have a sexual orientation, so talking about heterosexual things is completely okay. Cisgender people do not have a gender identity, and so talking about cisgender people is totally okay. Under the language of the law, one could argue that you can't talk about any sexual orientation or gender identity issues, which means that anytime you mention that someone is a man or a woman, anytime you mention that someone is married, anytime you make these references, that it is that it's a violation of the law. The problem with that is that the lawmakers that are making these laws, as well as the people who are executing these laws, is that they don't see that as being a violation, because being heterosexual and being cisgender is normal. And so it is devoid of having a sexual orientation and gender identity. And so what it does is it also singles trans people out and specifically says, like, you are the ones who are different because you have a gender identity, as opposed to being normal and lacking one completely. Okay, one other question that we have is, what can non-lawyers do to support the trans community? Ash, do you want to take that one first?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, what can non-lawyers do to support the trans community?
I think the biggest thing is support the trans people around you in your life, in your community. Trans people, we are dealing with a lot right now, externally, internally, just dealing with this amount of bigotry and oppression and discrimination. It's a lot. Just make extra space for the trans people in your life. If you don't know any personally, there are queer organizations that can help connect you to people looking for resources, mutual aid projects. Yeah, just be more connected into your community.
And though I'm not a trans person, I would say also be vocal when you see things. It's not up to, or it should not only be up to trans people to call out transphobic behavior. It's not only up to trans people to protest when these laws or bills are happening. It's not only up to trans people to ensure that their rights are protected. It's all of our responsibility. And that means that when we see a violation, we say something. When we see legislation being proposed, we protest. When we see things that are going to impact any member of the LGBTIQ plus community, but particularly trans people, that we involve ourselves, because it is not just a trans issue, it is an issue for all of us.
I fully agree. Thank you, Nathan.
And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. I know we are just at time. I want to thank Ash Tifa for coming and speaking today about the anti-trans movement in the United States. We will be following up with further information via email. So please look out for an email with that further information. But thank you again. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me. My email is on the screen. Ash, are you okay with people emailing you?
Yep.
Okay. And so you can also email Ash. Her email is on the screen too. Thank you again for coming, and happy Ida Habit to everybody.